Well, thank you everyone for joining us this Saturday morning. We are here to discuss a very big topic about identity. Does identity matter? And I think you can probably see from the crowded room on a Saturday morning that identity does matter. It matters to all of us, probably in lots of different ways, because the question of identity speaks to ideas about who we are, the fundamental question of who we feel we are in the world in which we feel we live and we relate to others, and how we feel about ourselves and those other people that we mix with and we come into contact with. And I want to say a few things about the concept of identity. Firstly, that we should recognise that identity doesn't exist in a vacuum, that although it can feel like some of the most personal questions about who you are and what is intrinsic to your being, in actual fact, identity is a very social thing. It involves identifications with collective groups, who we feel we belong to, who we feel we don't belong to. And it's also true that we don't just choose our identities out of nowhere. What our identities are and how we feel about our identity is shaped by social, economic, and political forces. And even if we try to downplay an aspect of our identity because we personally don't feel it's the most important thing about ourselves, actually, there are others who will assert it upon us. And this is why the questions of race and ethnicity become such an important part of the discussion about identity, especially for those of us from black or minority ethnicities, because we live in a world where the question of racism and ethnicity have become important, whether we feel they should be or we feel they shouldn't be. And this is just a very superficial snapshot of people who say that ethnicity and race matters to them in the context of the US. And as I say, identities are shaped by social, economic and political forces. And we're going to talk more about this throughout today. You think, for example, about Muslim identities, which we're going to have a whole session talking about Muslim identities and the way in which actually different historical, geopolitical forces have changed the way in which Muslim identities are created and in ways in which people feel about themselves. Not just in negative ways. We should say, actually, sometimes people feel their identities around race and ethnicity in positive ways. Lots of Muslims feel that they are part of a global network fighting injustice, or lots of black people celebrate black sense of pride and dignity. These aren't always negative things, but these are things that don't occur in a vacuum. And although they feel individual, are actually created by the political world in which we live. And the other thing I think we should say about identity is that identities are not neutral. In a world, actually, which is dominated by inequality, by division, by oppression, by racism, actually, despite lip service to questions of diversity and embracing difference, identities actually are very hierarchical, as constructed by the world in which we live. So capitalism maintains a hierarchy of identities, where some are seen as more important than others. So this is how racism, sexism, sexuality, even nationalism are all built on notions of superior and inferior, or on notions of normal and abnormal, where what it is to be normal in a certain society or in a certain group and what it is to be abnormal. And these don't just operate at the level of ideas and identity, these actually affect the material reality of your lives. So if you are black or Asian or from another minority ethnic group, this will affect your life chances from the moment that you're born to the moment that you die. It will affect even things like how you are likely to die, particularly in certain parts of the world. They materially influence your opportunities for education, for employment, all of the other things that are important in people's lives. And this is why, one of the reasons why there is so much conflict over questions of identity, because identities are not all treated as equal in the world in which we live. But I don't just want to talk about identity, because I think one of the reasons there is so much interest in this topic is not just talking about ourselves and our individual identities, but talking more about collective identities and attempts to struggle for justice, and actually looking at the question of what is identity politics. Because at its most basic, identity politics means any attempt to organise on the basis of a claimed shared identity and experience. And it has been used, and it carries on being used, in all sorts of different ways. It's been used to describe everything from the rise of Trump to anti-EU sentiment, to political Islam, nationalism, to all varieties of struggles against oppression, including Black Lives Matter, the Me Too movement. I could go on to lots more different examples. And there are some people and some commentators who see all of these as really rooted in the same phenomenon. I just recently read Francis Fukuyama's book on identity politics, and he is one of the people who sees these as really rooted in very similar processes. But actually, I think we should be careful not to equate left-wing and right-wing identity politics as the same thing, because actually often mainstream commentators even go as far as to blame left-wing identity politics for the rise of right-wing identity politics, for the rise of Trump and the rise of other forms of racist and oppressive right-wing politics. And I think we should reject this and actually say there is a difference. And we're going to talk about some of the specifics of those differences over the course of today. And obviously, the right wing clearly appeal to notions of identity in order to try to garner support for Trump's plan, appealing to the apparently left behind areas of America, or Farage has a very similar rhetoric. And I think in this you can also include the creation of an idea of a left behind white working class, something that I'm going to say more about later on, but will also come up again. We're having a particular session to discuss right-wing identity politics and populism. So I'm not really going to say more about that at this moment, except to say that when they try and construct ideas of a left-behind white working class, this is often also coupled to the idea that anti-racism, therefore, is a middle-class elite pursuit. And again, I think this is something we have to knock on the head, that actually anti-racism is something that belongs to all of us and is actually got a very good credentials among working-class people in Britain and around the world of being the people who've led the fight against racism. But what I want to talk about for the rest of my discussion, because I know also Tahir is going to talk more about the global and geopolitical situation, is I want to talk a little bit more about the identity politics of the oppressed. Because I think hopefully that's what most of us are really interested in and want to discuss, how we're going to actually change things for the better and what sorts of politics we need in order to do that. And so I think we should start by saying that identity politics has enormous strengths and enormous potentials. And I don't think that we should just be dismissing it, as some people do, as something that isn't of use to us. For starters, lots of different forms of identity politics gather people together on the basis of a shared injustice and demanding for change to that. It can create a very powerful sense of unity, and actually it can win real changes and real gains. And not just that, but in the process of winning and fighting and struggling, it can actually make people who are oppressed feel differently about themselves. You think actually probably about the most successful areas of what you might call identity politics, the Black Power movement or the gay liberation movement or the women's movement in the 1960s or the 1970s, who weren't fighting on their own, but actually as part of a wider movement, but all achieved substantial gains and actually changed how it felt. If you read all the accounts of people who were involved in the Black Power movement or the Black Panthers or any of these struggles in America, it changed not just the world in which they live, it changed how they felt about themselves. And that's a very important part of it. So when I go on to talk about some of the problems with identity politics as it works today and some of the limitations and try and pick apart some of that, I think we should always remember that we should defend identity politics of the oppressed against the right wing who want to shut it down for their own agenda and who want to attack it. But I am going to go on to talk about some of what I think are the limitations and the weaknesses of identity politics. And as I say, identity politics is a very big topic. So I'm making some sweeping generalisations. There will always be exceptions. And people, obviously, in the discussion may want to raise some of those and may want to, move into some more concrete examples. So let's look at some of the problems with identity politics. The first and most obvious problem is that just grouping people on the basis of a shared identity or shared experience doesn't replace the need to decide on what your strategy is. And actually, sometimes it can make strategy more difficult because it can hide the actual divisions between people who have allegedly a shared identity. So you think, for example, if we're organising on the basis of being black in itself is a controversial term that means lots of different things in lots of different contexts, but even organised on the basis of being black, there are lots of different strategies historically that have been based on this identity. Do we need support for more black businesses? Do we need black faces in high places? You know, we have had a black president in the most powerful country in the world. Do we need grassroots politics? Do we need the militancy of Malcolm X? Do we need, you know, or some of the, I'm sure we don't need Sean Bailey for Mayor of London. But that was just one example of some of the strategies that people may have come up with. There are lots of divisions among people who allegedly have the same identity. This picture, by the way, is from a really interesting strike that took place in 1982, the Rhindy textile strike that took place in the Midlands. And one of the reasons that this strike was so interesting is the actual employer of this company was also Asian and turned to the Indian High Commission to try and get them to intervene with the strikers and the strikers' supporters to say, we're all Asians, you shouldn't be striking against us. We've done a really brilliant interview with Avtar Jewel, who is the one of the key activists in the Indian Workers Association, which will be coming out in one of the forthcoming journals, where he talks quite a lot about some of these questions about identity, class struggle, and how those things fit together. I should also add that Angela Davis actually shouldn't really be on there because her politics isn't really a form of identity politics, but it is about talking about different strategies that people may call on. Angela Davis actually was very committed to building a multiracial working class movement against racism, but I kind of feel like every day gets better if you have a picture of Angela Davis at some point in that day. So let's put her up there anyway, just to remind us of some of the brilliance of people that, you know, that are still with us and still fighting today. Other problems, I think. So we have a problem that we still need strategy, and we have a problem that so-called identity politics, despite declaring the unity of people with a shared identity, often hides divisions. So you could have an Asian identity and be a striker or be on the Asian rich list. You still may define yourself as Asian. It doesn't deal with some of these divisions and some of these conflicts that exist within it. But there are a couple of other problems as well. One of them is the question of authenticity. Because as I said at the beginning, identity is not just personal. It's about what we share or what other people think we share. What Benedict Anderson, when he was writing about nationalisms, calls the imagined communities that we create and that we feel that we are part of. And that involves the question of who is in and who is out. And that begs the question of who decides who is in and who is out. And, you know, there are probably quite a few people here who, like myself, are from a mixed heritage, which is a strange term in itself, because I think probably everybody, if you look at it properly, is from a mixed heritage. But we're all very aware of this question of who's in and who's out. Are you black? Are you not black? The people who say that you're not and the people who say that you're not white. People are very aware of this. Who gets to choose who is in and who is out of a particular identity? And often that rests on the most articulate or the people who are chosen sometimes by the state to be put forward as the community leaders who profess to speak for a whole group but often don't. And in this sense, identity politics can essentialise something that is actually very fluid and very changeable. We know this because we know that the whole concept of race itself is an invention. And it isn't just when it comes to creating categories of black. It's the same when you think about the creation of the category of white and whiteness. In colonial Hispanic America, you could actually escape blackness by buying a certificate to say that you were white. So as long as you had the money, you could be white. It wasn't based on an identity of what you looked like. It was really based on what money you had. In 1890, if you were a Portuguese emigrant who went to Guyana, you would find that you were classified as non-white. But if your twin sister emigrated the same year to America, she would find that she was white. So these categories are invented and they're fluid, and somebody has to decide who's in and who's out. And that's why actually identity politics can be so prone to fragmentation. And you see that actually in the history of anti-racism in Britain. If you look at the way in which black emerged as a political term in the 1970s, encompassing people who were black, Asian, of other ethnicities who were fighting against racism. But after the Brixton riots in 1981, Thatcher's government really set about trying to create a buffer against black resistance by encouraging the fragmentation of that identity, setting up projects so different ethnicities could compete for money and for recognition. And it's interesting to see the way in which that helped to develop the idea of different ethnicities competing with each other, encouraged by the state and making it clear that neoliberalism can live with identity politics of that sort, the kind of market economy of identity, if you like. A couple of other comments that I wanted to say just about the current character of a lot of identity politics as it exists today. One is, I think there is a weakness in current identity politics in the focus on symbolism and language. Assad Haider, for example, in his brilliant book on mistaken identity, I really recommend it, gives an example of the campus that he worked on in America erupting into mass student struggle, very dynamic struggle, pulling in lots of different people, but how that struggle then got paralysed by infighting and arguments over whether or not they could occupy one of the buildings or call for occupation of one of the buildings, because occupy has got colonial connotations of occupying other countries. Now, there's nothing wrong with having this discussion in itself, but that demobilised a movement that was actually trying to win some gains and win some change for all students at that university. And I'm not saying that it's not important, because symbolism and language can be very important, but they shouldn't become a substitute for challenging some of the vast inequalities that we face, and in particular, challenging some of the institutional racisms and the structural racisms that are embedded in the state and in the world in which we live. And the other thing about current forms of identity politics is they can become very focused on individual experience and individual offence. Now, that's not to say that that offence might not be valid, and often the sorts of offences that people call out are valid, but it can actually move the discussion away from, again, from changing the whole structure of racism to calling out individual bad behaviours or looking for personal solutions or looking for personal promotions, and actually end up reducing the quality of debate. If a debate is if you're able to shut down a debate by saying, I have this experience, you cannot really question or argue with me, then that actually limits the level of debate at which things are taking place over the important questions that we talk about. And that really brings me back to the question of strategy, because the greatest weakness of all with identity politics, particularly in its current forms, I think, is that it's not up to the task of the huge scale of problems that we face in the world today. Because actually, if you're going to limit the struggle against the far right or the struggle against Islamophobia, the two things are absolutely connected, to just the people who suffer that oppression, you're actually going to limit the forces that are available to us to actually challenge these very important battles. So, for example, for Islamophobia, I do not believe that this should be the responsibility of Muslims alone to challenge that. This should be the responsibility of everybody to fight against those sorts of divisions in society. And identity politics can move you away from that sort of strategy that's effective to do that. So I've got a couple of minutes left, and I just want us to start thinking about some alternatives. What are the alternative politics on offer to identity politics? One alternative is the alternative of kind of, if you like, colourblindness, the idea that people just won't recognise race or ethnicity. And I've heard this both from the left and from the sort of liberals, that people will just reject the categories and the concepts altogether. Unfortunately, just doing that doesn't eliminate the inequalities and the difficulties that we face. The other alternative that's sometimes put is this kind of alternative that we have from David Blunkett, the idea that we could have not an alternative to identity politics, but a more progressive form of identity politics. Francis Fukuyama puts the same argument, actually, that what we need is a progressive nationalism that invites everybody into nationhood and everybody into, Britishness, or a new form of nationalism, if you like, that's a much more progressive thing. Now, my own view, people may differ and we may want to debate this, my own view is that British nationalism can't be reclaimed for the left. This is a project that has been built out of colonial oppression, and it isn't something that is going to become progressive just because we declare it as inclusive or progressive. And actually, I prefer the response from Albert Einstein when asked whether he was a Jew or a German, and said that it was entirely possible to be both, and said that nationalism is an infantile disease, it is the measles of mankind. And actually, speaking as a health professional, I can say that the threat of measles is on the global increase. So something that we need to be quite worried about, being spread actually by people whipping up scare stories, scapegoats, all the same kind of things that happen with nationalism, funnily enough. Not all nationalisms are the same, and obviously the nationalism of oppressed people is very different to the nationalism of British nationalism, but I think it's a nice quote anyway, and a nice answer to that point. And I'm just going to finish on these points, really, is I want to suggest an alternative to identity politics that is based on Marxism, and that is based not just on experience, although experience can tell us a lot of things, but is also based on a wider understanding and digging really behind experience to understanding the origins and functions of racism. The origins in an attempt to justify the transatlantic slave trade from the 16th century onwards, but also the many reinventions that racism has undertaken since slavery, precisely because it is such a useful tool for the elite to use to try and divide and rule the majority of people and to create convenient scapegoats for the failings of the capitalist system and the system that they preside over. And that's why we've seen racism constantly reinvented, finding new targets. You think about campaigns against Jewish people, against Irish people, against black people, against Muslims. We could go on. The targets change precisely because this is so useful. The scapegoating of migrants is one of the big threats that we face at the moment. And this affects the question of how we organise, because if we think that racism is about entrenching class rule from the top and is about dividing working class people, then that means that actually all working class people have an interest in challenging that. And I want to finish just with one final point, really, which is just about the question of class, because I think it's important to think, this is just these are not recommended books, by the way, the recommended books are all at bookmarks. This is just to give you an idea about, so much stuff is written about race, class, gender, actually even sexuality got one little mention in that lot. But it's to say that class isn't just one of many identities in the way that it's talked about in a lot of books. Class is not based on how we feel or how we identify or what accent we have, or whether we drink out of a cafetiere or wear dirty boots. Some of us do both of those things, so we're really confused. But class isn't based on these things. It isn't based on lifestyle. It isn't based on identity. It's based on an economic relationship. That isn't to say it isn't interesting. There's lots of interesting things we could say about class identities. But class is actually under capitalism based on an economic relationship of the people who own and control the means of production and the rest of us who basically have to go and work in one way or another to keep the system going and to create the profits that exist in it. And one of the things that I think we should remember is that the working class is actually not your Tommy Robinsons. Tommy Robinson is not a working class man, by the way. The man is a small businessman who's funded by the rich of the world, but likes to hold himself up as an example of the working class. Actually, the working class is the most diverse section of society and holds the potential to unlock the problems that we face. This is just an example from the NHS where I work, where actually 1 in 5 workers in the NHS is from a black or an ethnic minority, a very important part of the working class and a very important part of the solutions, really, to the problems that we all face. And that means, really, a solution that is based on seeing the working class, black and white and Asian, and in all its different ethnicities, as part of the solution to unlocking the struggle. And we'll talk more about this in the session at the end of today, where we talk about the Marxist tradition. This doesn't mean ignoring questions of oppression. There's a real stereotype of Marxism that it doesn't care about oppression. And it's absolutely not the case. It's not possible to effectively have a class struggle unless you actually take up some of the political ways in which people are divided and some of the inequalities and the oppression that exist among people. It also doesn't mean that we should be ignoring questions of identity. Identity, the experience of injustice, for many of us, is how we become political. It's how we start to care about ourselves, about other people, and when we see injustice in the world, of how it moves us into action. Identity and experience are very important. They're a good starting point, but they don't give us enough tools to solve the huge problems and the inequalities that we face in the world. And that's why I think, although we do want people who are oppressed to lead in our movement, because apart from anything else, we want to disprove the lies that we're not capable of leading our movement, we do want to build a multiracial movement where everybody is part, who has an interest in challenging the system, where everybody can be part of fighting for a different world.
Good morning, and thank you very much for this opportunity. I'd like to thank the conference organisers for the invitation to speak, and for you, the audience, for taking the time out on a Saturday morning. Now, we live in interesting times, a much used analogy in the current epoch, but the current events of our times are raising all sorts of challenges that are leading to no real solutions. Neoliberal capitalism, the dominant force within the global north, is driving people apart, and widening inequalities is the norm everywhere, as what is left of the welfare state is clawed back further still. A so-called free market economic adventure that was reinvigorated by the machinations of a political elite looking to sell off the family silver, where there is no such thing as society, has led to a hugely unequal set of conditions and relations that continue to amplify. Britain's economic system has been taken over by oligarchs with vested political interests. It is difficult to break down as it is self-selecting and resistant to outside pressure. Workers are completely locked out of the capital accumulation process. The media is biased and our politics is broken. There is a loss of the imagination on all matters of race, identity, and politics. But resistance is not futile. Far from it. We are seeing ordinary people become wiser to the psychopolitics of big technology. We are witnessing a youth mobilization in relation to climate change, decolonization of the curriculum, and an attitude towards diversity that is largely encouraging. But the battle rages on. Indeed, there are numerous challenges facing Britain as it grapples with issues of diversity, belonging, and mobility, especially when it is apparent that the pernicious forces of racism and racialization continue to affect the nature of the lived experience in Britain more widely. These concerns are especially pointed when it comes to discussing the experiences of British Muslim minorities, now numbering over 3 million and making up 5% of the population, and where over 90% of British Muslims live in England, with London containing 2/3 of all Muslims in Britain. These Muslims effectively make up over 1/3 of all ethnic and racial minorities. 1 in 4 of Britain's minorities are South Asian Muslims. And these groups are the focus of much of the gaze of media and political actors interested in questions of cultural relativism, grooming, racialization, extremism, and political violence. This disproportional attention, however, takes attention away from the needs and wants of minorities as a whole, concentrating on the negative traits relating to the experiences of the few who fall down the fissures created by the wider workings of society. Post-war migration processes have led to around 2 million Bangladeshis, Indians, and Pakistanis, with half under the age of 25 and 1 in 3 under the age of 15. These demographics represent particular challenges in relation to participation and engagement. But these issues reflect also on the failures of integration and diversity policy, combined with downward pressures on social mobility. It exposes the failure of government policy, leading to the inability of Muslim communities to plan, invest, and deliver in relation to the Islamic cultural and civic education and development needs of the younger generations. While this is not the norm by any stretch, the margins of these spaces reveal acute contestations in relation to being, becoming, and belonging. And in this milieu, there are genuine issues of identity which have implications for citizenship. And there are, of course, also wider concerns relating to gender that one needs to consider too, including what it means for questions of masculinity and femininity, which are expressed culturally, theologically, and politically. And how Muslim groups interpret and imply Islam is also crucial to understand, with instances of both progressive and regressive readings of the faith, leading to risks in relation to extremism, radicalization, and political violence. But because of these specifically localized problems in relation to the apparent unassimilability of Muslims in parts of towns and cities across the country, where these rough edges in relation to Muslimness are regarded as not merely a blot on the landscape, but as a potential danger to the rest of society, Islamophobia grows. It does so exponentially, given the wider problems of growing economic inequality, political division, and social conflict that affect us all in an age of anger due to a distrust of the political classes and a fear of the other exploited by the very same demagogues aiming to capitalize on the discord for political gain. All, however, are woefully ignorant of history. But their frustrations know no bounds due to the lack of any clear vision or direction on the way forward except to retreat into exceptionalism, nativism, and populism. These consequences, the consequences of structural, institutional, and cultural Islamophobia for some push people inwards, leading to cultural withdrawal. And in some cases, it leads to a few to reject society and the religio-cultural norms of their parents in pursuit of political resistance based on their own notions of purity or utopianism, some of which leads to paths of extremism and ultimately political violence. And in these complex, multi-layered realms, violence is seen as a solution to historical, immediate, and future predicaments created by enmity towards Islam. And thus, the circle is complete, At the fringes of all aspects of society, Islamophobia causes radicalization, and vice versa. The education system in Britain is unable to prepare young people for a diverse, interdependent, mutually enhancing globe in which we all have a stake. Rather, it continues to divide along class and ethnic lines. The likes of the far right also play on the dread of Islam, not Muslims, such is the simplistic, unenlightened worldview that they have come to appreciate. They feed into and draw sustenance from this Islamophobia, radicalized to the extent of not merely delegitimizing specific Muslim practices, but the idea of Islam itself. This creates further tensions as it, by design, engulfs all Muslims, leading to retreat for some who might have ordinarily worked towards balancing Muslim life with the secular existence in a liberal democracy. The menacing effects of Islamophobia reflect on wide-ranging aspects of racism, which has the consequence of pushing many more Muslims from all walks of life to radicalize, although ordinarily still struggling over their Muslimness. Sadly, we also have to come to terms with the reality that there are forms of cumulative radicalization. We have to come to terms with the fact that in the case of the Christchurch terror attack, the primary suspect is a self-identified white supremacist who viewed the world in Manichean terms, regarding Islam and Muslims as a single movement and its people who are not merely a blot on the landscape, but deserve to be depopulated. This is because they somehow present a risk to the survival of the white nation. But of course here, there is no perspective on the nature of this whiteness, that is, its own internal diversity, or the historical legacies of class formation, colonialism, Orientalism, eugenicism, or white nationalism that have defined the space occupied by whiteness. But this perspective is also an odd combination. There is a palpable fear presented in relation to the other, whose motivations are to take over through population expansion. But at the same time, there's a decrying of these others for their primitive, backward, and hateful natures, thus legitimizing ethnic nationalism and white supremacism. Some regard this as a reality of Islamophobia. They would be accurate in this instance. Islamophobia is not merely a response to a sense of cultural dilution at the hands of some regressive other. It extends into notion of ethnic cleansing of these groups. And there is much to expand on the nature of the motivations of white supremacist suspects who attack worshippers in mosques and synagogues, which align with the activities of other individual actors apparently acting on their own. The idea of the lone wolf terrorist is a complete misnomer. All have carried out acts of ultraviolence in the name of defending against the loss of privileges associated with whiteness at one level, but also the fear of being overtaken by hordes of primitives. These kinds of ideas have motivated far-right extremists in the last few years in a number of places in the global north, including in Norway, Canada, England, and now in New Zealand. These reasons for these are structural, cultural, and political. Over the last 2 decades in particular, men have faced considerable challenges to their positions in society, especially in the labor market and in educational terms. This is the result of improving positions for women in these settings, but also because globalization means that the average young white man has to compete far harder than ever before, and where his privileged urban post-industrial patriarchy can no longer be sustained in the light of an increasingly interdependent world. The rage against the loss of supremacy results in the venting of a certain fury against significant others. There was a time, well before the events of 9/11, where multiculturalism and diversity were seen as assets that contributed to the well-being of nations, where differences among people resulted in an enriched, lived reality that benefits all in the pursuit of human values. But multiculturalism became distorted when the political and media classes began to shift attention away from these notions as they associated the concept with the risk of polarization, radicalization, and ultimately terrorism. Multiculturalism or diversity has been completely securitized in the current space. And it's not beyond the realm of many who have had a classical education, let's put it that way, to think that too much diversity can lead to the fragmentation of the nation itself. Alas, the political experiment with diversity was over before it began, which has led to further polarization and entrenchment in various physical concentrations within urban spaces. And in the wider context of growing Islamophobia across the world today, these anti-Islam and anti-Muslim voices grow louder at a time when politicians in Hungary, Slovakia, Slovenia, and Poland evoke populist sentiment. This is especially the case as many of these countries were directly affected by the Syrian refugee crisis that began in 2015, which saw over 500,000 people walking through the Balkans on their way to countries like Germany. Taken as a whole, the extreme far right in Europe focused on the historical dynamics of Ottoman history and Christian Europe. For example, Andres Breivik made clear links, seeing himself as a Knight Templar, saving Christianity from the invasive Muslim other. These notions appeal to young men who are at the fringes of their societies, burying themselves in the discourse of the far and the radical right online, with its focus on hate towards differences, women, and groups of different sexual preferences or leanings. All of it supports the projected inherited importance of the average white male who has to club together with greater cause in order to A, save the white nation from invasion through immigration and mixing, and B, to eliminate other undesirables as they are breeding at excessive rates, and unless checked, they will fully absorb the white nation. So I want to thank the organizers for the opportunity, again, to speak about these concepts. And I hope some of these ideas around how we think about diversity, multiculturalism, in the context of a society and an economy that's leading to polarizations and divisions, is creating more challenges than opportunities. And we are in a very interesting period in history in regards to these acute challenges in this present moment. And without obvious solutions, the idea of retreat has become the dominant narrative among the elites, but also among groups whose idea of identity politics has also been placed under pressure. So I thank you for your time and attention. I look forward to your thoughts and comments.